Ladies and gentlemen, as the year closes out, welcome to gaming's top 10 most embarrassing moments. At least this is my personal list. Our lists may not match. I may not cover everything because there was just so much this year that made me at least facepalm, but I'm going to cover as much as I can. I'm going to cover the news and events and games that stood out to me the most in terms of embarrassing moments. And there's a lot to cover, so let's just dive right in, and also Happy New Year to all of you wonderful people. Number 10, Rocket League. So this is a great game that is, or was rather, unfortunately marred by random paid rewards, by loot boxes. But after Epic acquired the studio that created this game and also acquired the game itself, it was announced that they would be removing loot boxes outright and replacing them with what's called blueprints. And this seemed like a great idea at first until we saw the end results. It turned out that they introduced a monetization system that, yes, it did minimize RNG, the randomized aspect of paid rewards, but turns out that the non-random monetization system they introduced ended up being worse than the loot boxes. And the reason for this was because prices for items were marked up to an extent that made the loot boxes a better bang for your buck. And also prices were super inconsistent, so items that used to be pretty rare were not so rare anymore, and then more common items, their prices were marked up, and this level of inconsistency ruined the trading economy for the game, which a lot of players engaged in. And then more recently, they did try to reduce the prices, but they didn't reduce them enough, and a lot of people predicted this happening. This 2 steps forward, 1 step back maneuver where companies introduce the worst possible version of a monetization system, knowing there's going to be backlash, so that when the backlash happens, they only take 1 step back and pretend as if they've been listening to feedback, when taking 1 step forward was their plan all along by doing the 2 step forward, 1 step back maneuver. Plenty of people predicted that this would happen, that they wouldn't back away from these ridiculous prices enough, just backpedal a little bit, and the community as a whole just isn't happy with the way Rocket League has handled monetization. Number 9, Call of Duty Black Ops 4. This is a game that obviously launched last year, but its ridiculous monetization, courtesy of Activision, carried through 2019. The year opened with this game right here, introducing that dot reticle that was sold for $1. It's literally just a dot that they're charging money for. And then there was that smiley face reticle that was in previous games at no charge that Black Ops 4 decided to charge $2 for. Ludicrous prices for these graphics that are super simple to make. And this was after a monetization system that a lot of people weren't happy about, that a lot of people saw degrading over time, getting worse and worse, stingier and stingier. And then in February, they added the frickin' loot boxes in the worst way possible, and this was done after reviews, on top of the fact that this game was sold at full price with Season Pass and Battle Pass, and on top of the standard microtransactions, layered with a grindy progression system intended to have players spend money to mitigate insufferable grind. And these loot boxes became worse and worse over time until they eventually introduced weapons within them, making these loot boxes flat out pay to win. Now, Black Ops 4 did eventually remove the loot boxes towards the end of the game's life cycle, when it least mattered, close to Modern Warfare's launch. If there is one live service that exemplifies the greed of game companies like Activision, it's Black Ops 4. Number 8, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. It is no secret that this game's launch was rough as hell. It not only launched broken, which seems to be a common theme with a lot of AAA games these days. The gameplay was also bland, the visuals were flat out unimpressive, and this game for some reason introduced these looter-shooter elements that didn't feel like they belonged in this game. It seems like a game that was built around monetization rather than a game that was created with the sole intent of delivering a fun experience. And the monetization, blatantly pay to win, and this is on top of a broken game that launched super buggy. The pay to win elements essentially involve the selling of weapons, armor, upgrades, XP boosters, and flat out skill points. And then after the backlash came, the worst part was that the developers tried to pretend as if the more pay-to-win elements of the monetization system of this game, of the in-game shop, was accidental. They actually released a statement saying that the more pay-to-win stuff was meant to be introduced down the line so that new players could catch up to people who have been playing this game for a while. Not only is them saying that they were going to introduce pay-to-win down the line a bad look on its own, because that's kind of what Black Ops 4 did, there is also the fact that the notion of accidentally adding pay-to-win microtransactions is utterly ridiculous. These monetization systems are heavily scrutinized by game companies because they are the main source of income oftentimes. They make the most money with these games from these microtransactions, so they really comb through these things. And I can guarantee you that the introduction of pay-to-win for Ghost Recon at launch was no accident. They just backpedaled after the backlash and pretended this was all an accident in order to mitigate some of the PR nightmare they suffered. But it really didn't work. Nobody really bought that excuse. And so the end result of all of this was that Ghost Recon Breakpoint sold rather poorly. Number 7, NBA 2K20 and its gambling trailers. So this is yet another example of a AAA game that has launched broken. And this is not an unfamiliar territory for a lot of these sports titles that are annualized that give no time for developers to actually implement new mechanics and polish everything up. But what really drew attention to NBA 2K20 this year was the shameless gambling trailers that essentially showed a bunch of influencers, if you will, reacting to them doing the roulette minigames and slot machine minigames, these imageries of gambling that are implemented throughout NBA 2K20, a basketball game that often feels like it's gambling with a side of basketball rather than basketball with a side of gambling. Now, it should be noted that these roulettes and slot machines, these mini games, appear after certain types of matches, and you don't technically spend currency on them, but the rewards earned through the slot machines and the roulette, they all tie back to the loot box system that is very much gambling. And not to mention that things like roulette and slot machines, the way they're represented in NBA 2K20, it is very much how you would find them in casinos. It is imagery of an adult activity. And yet, despite all of this, PEGI and the ESRB refuse to label this game as a more mature title. It is rated E for everyone in the US, and PEGI has rated it PEGI 3. And their excuse for this is that, well, loot boxes aren't legally gambling yet, so we can just brush that off as not gambling. And for the imagery of gambling, they seemingly don't scrutinize that as long as you're not spending currency on the slot machines and the roulette. They don't actually look at how the imageries of roulette and slot machines tie back into the overall gameplay system and into the loot boxes. They're essentially just trying to skirt away with technicalities rather than looking at the overall implications of these imageries that essentially reinforce this addiction, this potential addiction for a lot of these young minds who are more prone to be afflicted by this stuff. It is abundantly clear that these ratings boards are lobbied by game companies. There's no way someone with just basic common sense would deem NBA 2K20, the way that trailer was conveyed and the way the game is designed, there's no way anyone with common sense would see that as clearly for kids. Number 6, Epic Game Store. So this is a storefront that I think had a lot of great potential. When it was first announced and when they relayed the plans for the store, a lot of people were excited that Steam would finally get some competition. I think a lot of people dug this idea of giving developers a bigger revenue cut. That was a noble cause, but then the Epic Game Store began to do things that customers were not particularly pleased by, namely forcing them to use this particular store to play certain games by securing third-party exclusivity, limited-time exclusivity. And perhaps this wouldn't be as big of an issue if the Epic Game Store had launched feature complete, but when it did launch, it was woefully lacking in features, and it is still woefully lacking in features compared to Steam. So a lot of people would like the choice of choosing between Steam and Epic, but Epic didn't allow for that choice for a lot of these games, like Metro Exodus. This is when I think the issue really became a big deal. This was a game that already took pre-orders on Steam, that was very close to launching on Steam before it was snatched away out of the blue. So that became a whole issue. And then there were a lot of crowdfunded projects that promised a Steam release that were snatched away by Epic, Outer Wilds, Shenmue 3, Phoenix Point, among others, and that caused further contention the way Epic was kind of screwing over a lot of these Steam customers who prefer playing games on Steam. And the end result to Epic's aggressive handling of their store, their aggressive push towards third-party exclusivity, is that there's just been a negative cloud surrounding Epic, a lot of review bombings for games that do go Epic, and there's just this huge stigma surrounding the storefront to the point where when we hear stories about developers refusing Epic Store exclusivity to keep their promise to Steam users and to support Steam users, that stuff is celebrated and seen as honorable. Not to mention that there are indie developers who have asked Epic to feature their game on their storefront alongside Steam and GOG and whatnot. But Epic is only accepting multi-platform releases on PC for the AAA games like Cyberpunk 2077, whereas indie developers like the guy who made Dark, well, that individual can only release the game on Epic or on Steam, not on both. Epic is not giving developers, the smaller developers, that choice, and that kind of paints an even more negative image, and that further compounds the negative cloud surrounding Epic Games Store. It'd be one thing if they pursued first-party exclusivity where they fund their own games and create unique experiences on Epic, like Fortnite is an Epic Store exclusive and people don't mind that because it is an Epic game that they funded and its existence is owed to Epic Games. But this snatching away of games that aren't theirs, that are primed for Steam release, that's what's been pissing people off. And that's where I think Epic Games Store really slipped up and is causing a lot of ire within the gaming community. No doubt that higher revenue cut is good for developers, but they have to consider the overall picture of this relationship between developers and customers. And currently a lot of the customers feel as though this is just an awful way to launch a storefront. Number 5, Google Stadia. This is a platform that a lot of people had many doubts about, but then closer to launch, we learned a number of things that made this platform completely untenable. So first of all, it's got a ton of missing features. A lot of the things and cool elements that they spoke about during press conferences, they're just not there at launch. Then there is the fact that you do have to spend $130 currently in order to be able to access Stadia. You have to get that $130 Founders Edition. And then when it comes to being able to play on any screen with Stadia, which is the marquee feature of the platform, that also has limited functionality. For TV, for example, you do need a Chromecast Ultra. If you have a smart TV, you can't just access Stadia from there, so there is a setup process. For PC, you do need Google Chrome, which caps out at 1080p, 60 frames per second, even though 4K 60 FPS is a feature that they're charging monthly for, but on Chrome, only goes up to 1080 60. And then for phones, you do currently need a Pixel device, and that is a major issue because a lot of people have other phones other than Pixels. On top of that, Stadia just has a really meager library of games consisting of titles that we have already played. There are no first-party exclusives, no must-own titles. Games also tend to look and perform worse on Stadia, even though the hardware is supposed to be twice as powerful as Xbox One X, and not to mention that there is compression issues that come with streaming that further diminishes the visuals of a game compared to consoles like Xbox One X. There's also the fact that the game streaming technology is still not 100% reliable. Even if you have good internet connection, you might experience stutters that get in the way of the more frenetic games that require precision. There's an over-reliance on internet connection, so you have to keep track of your internet speed, your internet cap, and if you do lose internet connection, your access to Stadia is completely cut off, whereas with a Nintendo Switch, a dedicated portable console, you don't need internet to play a lot of your games. Also, Stadia is selling 4K 60 FPS at a monthly fee, and yet they cannot deliver 4K 60 FPS on all games as originally promised, especially for a lot of the high-profile AAA games. But even for games like Destiny 2, which shouldn't require an incredible amount of hardware power, that only caps out at 1080 60 FPS rather than 4K 60 FPS. And there are plenty of other games like that that run at lower resolution and frame rates than Xbox One X, which is again half as powerful as Stadia. And then we have also seen some games like Borderlands 3 launch with an outdated version that is missing certain patches, updates, fixes, and content. And even with all of these drawbacks, Stadia expects people to pay full price for individual games that you may lose access to if this service, God forbid, shuts down. And all of this has contributed to a platform that has sold poorly, we do know that, and that is primed to get eaten alive by other services, other cloud gaming services that are intent on handling this stuff better, like the upcoming Project xCloud. Number 4, EA and their surprise mechanics. Recall that this was back in June when, during a hearing with the UK Parliament, EA VP of Government and Legal Affairs Kerry Hopkins, when asked about the predatory nature of loot boxes, she started out by saying that EA doesn't call them loot boxes, they are surprise mechanics. And there was audible scoffing on the UK Parliament's end. This was EA's attempt to rebrand loot boxes, to name them something different in a piss-poor attempt to avoid scrutiny. But obviously what they did was shoot themselves in the foot, gained a whole lot of media traction, and were ridiculed for essentially thinking we're that stupid. Kerry Hopkins proceeded by saying that surprise mechanics are quite ethical and quite fun. She said that we think it's like many other products that people enjoy in a healthy way and with the element of surprise. And then she compared loot boxes or surprise mechanics to Kinder Eggs. Except, of course, that with Kinder Eggs, you don't have game companies constantly tweaking and controlling the odds. Kinder Eggs don't involve a core game that is so heavily tied to monetization that players can be manipulated into making these mass purchases. And then in a lot of games with loot boxes, items cannot be traded, and a lot of these items become worthless when the next iteration of that game comes out. So with FIFA, for example, because it's an annualized release, and because of the way items don't carry over, you spend all this money on card packs in 1 year, and then the next year you basically start from zero. If there is one moment in 2019 that exemplifies greedy game companies talking out of their asses to skirt away from tangible issues, it's this moment right here with surprise mechanics. And EA executive Matt Bilbey, after this whole debacle, actually had the audacity to, during an interview, express how he struggles with the notion and perception that EA are the bad guys. Number 3, Blizzard Blitzchung controversy. This was back in August when Blitzchung, a professional Hearthstone player, was suspended from a tournament for saying, for a brief few seconds, "Liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our time," which is a catchphrase used in the Hong Kong protests. Now, keep in mind that he just said the one thing. It took a few seconds. He didn't really disrupt the tournament. He just expressed support for his country. Blizzard's reaction was immediate and severe. Blitzchung was suspended from Grandmasters for a whole year, which is a lot for an esports player, and the casters who did let him say what Blitzchung said, they were suspended indefinitely. They were fired outright. It was abundantly clear that this was Blizzard capitulating to the Chinese government and to Chinese corporations. This was the way a Chinese company would react, not the way an American company would react. And all of this, of course, ties into the politics, the conflict between Hong Kong and China. This kind of swift and severe deliberation is very much a Chinese action, not an American action. And a lot of people seeing this, members of the community, Blizzard employees, media outlets, just about everyone protested against Blizzard and this kind of disgusting display of corporate capitulation. Seeing Blizzard employees protesting was especially impactful. You may recall that there's a plaque within Blizzard that says "All Voices Matter." That was covered up by employees, and there were dozens of employees who actually staged a walkout in support for Blitzchung and in dissent against Blizzard's actions and the way they reacted to this whole situation. Facing unprecedented scrutiny, Blizzard did eventually reduce the punishment, while providing this boilerplate unapologetic statement, they suspended Blitzchung for 6 months instead of for a whole year, and they brought back the casters, and they were suspended temporarily rather than permanently. But still, even then, the punishment was deemed too severe for what essentially amounts to a few seconds of a dude expressing support for his own country when he didn't disrupt the tournament in any significant way. And then Blizzard president J. Allen Brack took the stage at BlizzCon to issue this non-apology. You could hardly call what he said there an apology. It was more of a distraction. He never mentioned Blitzchung in the Grandmasters tournament directly. He never referenced the situation directly. He at one point just sort of began talking about the way video games unite gamers, and it was just a whole lot of nothing, really. The half-assed apology combined with how they moved on by unveiling Diablo 4 and Overwatch 2 and all of these different things made certain segments of the community just flat out forgive and forget, but for a lot of other people, this is something that will be memorialized as one of the most shameful things Blizzard has done yet, if not the most shameful thing. Number 2, Anthem. It is hard to believe that the BioWare we knew and loved has fallen this low, but here we are. Anthem, like a lot of other AAA games this year, launched utterly broken, a lot of crashing servers, a boring gameplay loop, awful loot and reward system, which really killed the game. And in March, at one point, they introduced a bug that they patched out. It was a fun loot bug that a lot of people were requesting that Anthem keep in, but God forbid people have fun in Anthem, so BioWare patched that out. And then in April of 2019, there was that Anthem expose by Kotaku editor Jason Schreier, which revealed a troubled development history, poor management, a lack of vision, awful employment practices, and flat-out deception with customers when they showed that E3 2017 gameplay presentation that said, in-engine and all of these different things. Turns out the game hadn't even been built when that was shown off. That was just a vertical slice, like a concept footage, essentially, that they eventually built the game around. So a lot of things surrounding this game, the way it was developed and the way it was presented, was completely immoral. And then in April, we learned that the roadmap they had set out for Anthem was completely crumbling. They had delayed a bunch of things, and then the entire roadmap was eventually delayed. It was clear that BioWare just couldn't keep up with the roadmap because they had to juggle between the myriad of significant issues that plagued Anthem, as well as developing new content that is in line with the roadmap. And while all that was happening, the community was providing plenty of feedback surrounding the way this game should function, the loot and reward system, but BioWare in large part ignored all of that feedback. Then as the player base began to decline, matchmaking became an issue, and then in early June, the roadmap was entirely deleted. BioWare deemed this roadmap completely untenable on their end, and there was just nothing in terms of where this game was headed to look forward to. The one major piece of content that they did eventually deliver on after numerous delays was the Cataclysm, but even that was woefully underwhelming. It was supposed to be the thing to take Anthem to the next stage, the big major expansion that would hopefully save Anthem, but that wasn't the case at all. And then throughout all of this time, we learned that key staff was starting to leave the project, which didn't inspire confidence. And finally, in November, BioWare did finally announce that they're doing a complete overhaul of Anthem, and we'll see what happens on that front. But as far as 2019 goes, Anthem was a major disaster, a disaster somehow even worse than that of Mass Effect Andromeda. And a lot of this wasn't even necessarily EA's fault. It was just a lot of mismanagement and incompetence on BioWare's part. They had 6 years to make this game, and this is what they put out. But no doubt that EA and their monetization mandates and their encouragement of developers using Frostbite, which is very difficult to use when you're making games that Frostbite wasn't intended to make. No doubt all of that also contributed to an incredibly rough product. Which finally brings us to number 1. I'm sure this will come as no surprise. Fallout 76. This is a game that came out last year, but continued to be at the forefront of headlines throughout 2019 due to its negligence, incompetence, and just baffling decisions. So, in early January, there was the whole Nuka Rum debacle when people who bought this collector's item were misled about the fact that the bottle shape was actually not the way it was advertised. It was a regular bottle inside a plastic shell, and it was just utterly laughable and ridiculous. Then in late January, Fallout 76 released a patch that actually reintroduced a lot of old bugs that broke the game more than it fixed. Then, fast forward a few months in April, that's when Bethesda broke their cosmetic promise by introducing the repair kits as a form of microtransactions. And while it wasn't pay to win per se, it is gameplay convenience being sold at a price. It's this whole idea of the way a lot of game developers are selling solutions to problems they've purposely introduced or purposely kept in. Then in June, during E3, replacement canvas bags finally arrived to the doorsteps of people who submitted tickets. Still looks pretty bad and kind of flimsy looking, but hey, I guess at least it's canvas. And then in July, a month later, scrap kits were introduced as an additional form of gameplay microtransactions, further breaking the promise of cosmetics only. And not to mention that this patch 11, once again, broke the game more than it fixed. They had a lot of game-breaking bugs that was just complete disaster. From there, they doubled down on these gameplay microtransactions with refrigerators and Collectron bots that were sold via microtransactions. Again, convenience items that are not pay to win per se, but still solutions to gameplay issues being sold at a price. And what makes this even worse is that all of these items that they're introducing as a form of payment, these are things that the community suggested, believing that Bethesda would just update the game with these solutions rather than charging people money for them. So they took community suggestions and sold them back. Jesus. Later that month, in late September, Fallout 76 faced the issue of the GameStop Nuka-Cola Power Armor helmets being moldy and being recalled as a result. Now, that wasn't Bethesda's fault. That seems to have been more GameStop's fault and the way they shipped the helmets that caused the mold to build in there. But the fact that something like this happened to Fallout 76, I don't know. It just seems to imply that Fallout 76 really is just a cursed game. From there, in a statement released in mid-October, Bethesda finally admitted that they did say cosmetics-only microtransactions, but in that same statement, they also added that after reviewing data, we just have to change the approach to microtransactions, and they left it at that. They just said we have to break our promise, and they officially retracted the promise they initially made and provided no real good reason whatsoever. And then in late October, we saw the introduction of the Fallout First subscription, which charged $100 a month while paywalling gameplay features like private servers, stash boxes, survival tents. Oh, and by the way, turns out that when Fallout First's gameplay features were released, they were broken at launch, despite charging money for them. Private servers, turns out, weren't so private, and the scrap boxes, instead of storing items, deleted them for no reason. And right around the same time, we learned that the Australian government forced Bethesda to refund players who requested Fallout 76 refunds because the game just didn't deliver on a lot of its promises and because it is a broken product. Then in November, we began to hear of reports involving loyal Fallout 76 players who would go out of their way to test hacks and cheats so that they knew how that stuff worked before reporting it back to Bethesda. These people were getting permanently banned because they were testing out hacks, even if the context was that they were testing them out for a good intention, to report to Bethesda about this stuff so they can patch this out. Even though community managers knew about the contributions that these players were making, the Bethesda support team, apparently there's just something infrastructurally wrong where the community managers can't communicate with Bethesda support. There's just this gap between them that doesn't allow them to be on the same page. And meanwhile, as all of this is happening, a lot of cheaters are getting away with a simple slap on the wrist. Cheaters who, by the way, are uploading videos of them doing these cheats, the ones who are actually causing harm to the game, they're not getting permanently banned. They're not getting severe punishment. This finally brings us to the string of failures throughout December when they first released a defective patch that made it so that reloading would cause legendary effects on your armor to be disabled until you re-equipped these items, and there are also reports of this defective patch causing faster weapon and armor degradation. From there, we have hackers who found a way to spawn any asset in the Fallout 76 engine into the game world from Fallout 4 assets, NPCs that can be used as companions, weapons, armor, items, resources, you name it, and also the hack allowed players to create their own legendary items and summon them into the world and sell them off and do whatever they want with it. And then after that hack was plugged, the same hacker found a way to steal people's inventory, their entire inventory, at the press of a few buttons very quickly. And it took Bethesda a couple days after reports of this hack began to spread to shut down the servers and actually resolve this issue. They didn't take any preemptive measures, so there were some hackers who managed to steal inventories of hundreds of players across the board. And on top of all of this, there's still duping issues, other forms of cheating issues and hacks and exploits. Bethesda's just failing to keep up, and that was especially apparent throughout 2019. And this is just Fallout 76. We haven't talked about Elder Scrolls Blades, which was touted as a pure Elder Scrolls experience before introducing timers and pay-to-win microtransactions and loot boxes. And then on a publisher level with Bethesda Softworks, we haven't talked about the disaster that was Wolfenstein Youngblood. And among other incidents, just anything with Bethesda on it was cursed this year, especially Fallout 76. This is a game whose foundation was created on an engine that's well known for being prone to bugs and glitches, for being inefficient in numerous areas, and for being highly moddable and exploitable and tweakable. That was by design for the single-player games, and all Bethesda did was adapt that into a multiplayer environment and called it a day without putting in the proper safeguards and measures. And here are the results: an utter, complete disaster. Just a fire that Bethesda cannot put out, they cannot keep up with. It's just insane to me that even a year after launch, we're seeing insane situations, unacceptable circumstances happen in Fallout 76. And I don't know, I have no confidence that things will improve, because Fallout 76 is rotten at the very core. And it's going to take Bethesda a while to get to a stable state with this game, or they're just never going to get there because they've just done such a poor job setting up a solid foundation. That brings us to the end of this segment, ladies and gentlemen. Gaming's biggest embarrassments of 2019. Let me know in the comments below what your list looks like. Let me know if I missed anything that you think is worth highlighting. And, thumbs up and like any comments that might feature other embarrassing aspects of gaming throughout 2019 that you think deserve a spotlight. Thank you for an awesome year. You guys have been amazing. You're an incredible community, and I just couldn't ask for anything more. You guys are just the best, and I cannot wait to see what 2020, this next decade, holds for us. We're just going to keep rising higher together as a community. Happy New Year to you all, and with that, I will see you in the next decade. Young out.